60 men stood in the semicircle. Every one of them carried a blade beneath his toga. And at the center of that circle stood the most powerful man on earth, unarmed, unguarded, and smiling at the men who were about to end his life. 23 wounds would be found on his body. But here is what 2,000 years of retellings have buried. Only one of those wounds was fatal. Just one. The other 22 were shallow, hesitant. Slashes to the arms, the thighs, the groin. Cuts made by trembling hands that could not look their victim in the eye. And the one blade that did find its mark, the single thrust between the ribs that collapsed his lung and ended the Roman Republic, we still do not know whose hand delivered it. But to understand how 60 men convinced themselves to butcher the man who had shown them mercy, we need to go back, not to the Senate floor, to a battlefield 7 years earlier, where Julius Caesar made the decision that would eventually kill him. By 49 BC, Gaius Julius Caesar had spent a decade conquering Gaul, modern France, Belgium, parts of Germany, and Britain. He had turned a provincial command into one of the greatest military campaigns in history. His legions worshipped him, the Roman people adored him, and the Senate feared him. The Senate, led by Pompey, once Caesar's closest political partner, demanded he disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar understood what that meant. Without his army, his enemies would prosecute him, strip his wealth, and destroy him politically. Perhaps literally. So on January 10th, 49 BC, Caesar marched his 13th legion across the Rubicon, a shallow river that served as the legal boundary between his province and Rome itself. Crossing it under arms was treason. There was no going back. The civil war that followed lasted 4 years. Caesar crushed Pompey's forces across 3 continents: Italy, Spain, Greece, Egypt, North Africa. Pompey himself fled to Egypt, where he was beheaded on the beach by men who thought Caesar would reward them for it. He didn't. According to Plutarch, when Caesar was presented with Pompey's severed head, he wept. This was his former friend, the husband of his beloved daughter Julia. Caesar had not wanted Pompey dead. He had wanted him defeated, pardoned, and brought back into the fold. And that instinct, the compulsion to forgive, is exactly what made the next 5 years possible. It is also exactly what made March 15th inevitable. Caesar's policy after the Civil War was unlike anything Rome had ever seen. He called it clementia, mercy. Every senator who had fought against him, every general who had taken up arms for Pompey, every politician who had voted for his destruction, Caesar pardoned them all. He restored their property, returned their titles, gave them positions of power. Among those pardoned was Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus had fought against Caesar at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC. He had chosen Pompey. He had bet against the man who, by most accounts, had treated him like a son. And this is where the story becomes personal in a way that most retellings fail to capture. Caesar had been the longtime lover of Servilia, Brutus's mother. The affair was well known in Rome. Suetonius records it as one of the worst-kept secrets in the Republic. Some ancient sources, though historians debate this, even whispered that Brutus might have been Caesar's biological son. Whether that rumor was true or not, the emotional bond was real. Caesar had protected Brutus throughout the Civil War, personally ordering his officers to spare Brutus if found on the battlefield. After the war, Caesar made Brutus governor of Cisalpine Gaul, one of the most prestigious appointments in the Republic. He was grooming Brutus for the consulship, the highest office in Rome. So what turned a man who owed his life, his career, and his freedom to Julius Caesar into the most famous assassin in history. The surface justification was ideology. Brutus came from a family that defined itself by opposition to tyranny. His ancestor, also named Brutus, had driven out the last king of Rome in 509 BC and founded the Republic. For Marcus Brutus, the family name was not just heritage, it was a mandate.
But surface justification is never the whole story. The personal grievance ran deeper. Caesar's mercy was not experienced as generosity by the men who received it. It was experienced as humiliation. Every pardon was a reminder, I could have destroyed you, and I chose not to. To proud Roman aristocrats, being forgiven was worse than being punished. Punishment acknowledges an equal. Mercy comes from above. And Roman senators did not accept that any man stood above them. Then there was Cassius. Where Brutus was philosophical and tormented, Cassius was calculating and bitter. He had expected a particular appointment from Caesar and received a lesser one. According to Plutarch, Cassius had been whispering in Brutus's ear for months, leaving anonymous notes on Brutus's chair in the Senate that read, "You are asleep, Brutus," and "You are not a true Brutus." The psychological undercurrent was the most dangerous of all. Brutus was not a man who could live with cognitive dissonance. He had accepted Caesar's mercy. He had dined at Caesar's table. He had risen through Caesar's patronage. And every single day that debt corroded his sense of himself as a free man. The only way to resolve the tension between what he owed Caesar and what he believed Rome needed was to destroy the source of the debt entirely. And then there was the contextual pressure that turned private resentment into conspiracy. In February 44 BC, the Roman Senate declared Caesar dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. Not for a term, not for a crisis, forever. For men raised on the story of the Republic's founding, the overthrow of kings, those two words were a death sentence. Not for Caesar, for everything they believed Rome was supposed to be. But there is a figure in this conspiracy who history has almost entirely forgotten, and he may be the most important one of all. Decimus Brutus was not Marcus Brutus's brother. They were distant cousins at best. What made Decimus dangerous was something far worse. He was Caesar's actual friend. Not a political ally, not a pardoned enemy, a genuine companion. Caesar had named Decimus as a secondary heir in his will. They dined together. They trusted each other. And on the morning of March 15th, it was Decimus, not Cassius, not Marcus Brutus, who would ensure that Caesar walked into the trap. The night before the assassination, Caesar dined at the home of Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. According to Plutarch, the dinner conversation turned to an unexpected topic. What is the best kind of death? Caesar's answer was immediate. A sudden one, he said. He had no idea how precisely that wish would be granted, but what happened next suggests that some part of him did know what was coming. Suetonius records that Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, woke screaming from nightmares that night. She dreamed of holding Caesar's bleeding body. She begged him not to go to the Senate the next morning. And Caesar, the man who had crossed the Rubicon, who had conquered Gaul, who had defeated every enemy the world could throw at him, agreed. He sent word that he would not attend. The conspiracy was collapsing. 60 men had committed to treason, and their target had decided to stay home. If the Senate met without Caesar that day, the plot would unravel. Someone would talk. Someone always talks. So they sent Decimus, the one man Caesar would never suspect, the friend. Decimus arrived at Caesar's home that morning and, according to Suetonius, mocked him gently.
He told Caesar that the Senate was preparing to offer him the title of king outside Italy, a massive honor. He told Caesar that canceling over his wife's dreams would make him look weak. Would the great Caesar let the Senate say he was ruled by a woman's nightmares? Caesar relented. He walked out his door with Decimus at his side. Somewhere along that walk, a man named Artemidorus, a teacher of Greek philosophy who had learned of the plot, pushed through the crowd and pressed a scroll into Caesar's hand. The scroll contained the names of every conspirator. Caesar never read it. He carried it in his hand, still rolled, all the way to the Senate. The Senate was meeting that day, not in its usual chamber, but in the theater of Pompey, a vast complex on the Campus Martius. The irony was savage. They would kill Caesar at the foot of a statue of Pompey, the man Caesar had defeated and mourned. As Caesar entered, a senator named Julius Caesar approached with a petition, a request to recall his exiled brother. Caesar waved him off. Caesar grabbed Caesar's toga and pulled it from his shoulder. That was the signal. Publius Servilius Casca struck first. He swung his dagger at Caesar's neck, but his hand was shaking so badly that the blade only grazed Caesar's chest. Caesar spun around, grabbed Casca's arm, and shouted, in Latin, not Greek, "Casca, you villain, what are you doing?" For a moment, one frozen, impossible moment, Caesar fought back. He was 55 years old, unarmed, alone, and surrounded by 60 armed men. And he fought. He used the only weapon he had, a metal stylus, a writing instrument, and stabbed Casca in the arm. But the circle closed. Blade after blade found him. According to the forensic analysis of ancient sources compiled by historian Barry Strauss, most of the wounds were superficial. Slashes to the thighs, the arms, the back. The assassins were stabbing wildly, hitting each other in the frenzy. Cassius accidentally slashed Brutus across the hand. Several senators who were not part of the conspiracy were cut by the panicked crowd trying to flee. And in the middle of this chaos, Caesar saw him. According to Suetonius, drawing on accounts that may trace back to eyewitnesses, Caesar looked up through the blades and the blood and saw Marcus Brutus moving toward him with a drawn dagger. What Caesar said in that moment has been debated for 2,000 years. Shakespeare gave us Et tu, Brute, a line of English poetry that never left a Roman's lips. Suetonius records a different version. He writes that Caesar spoke in Greek. Kaisu, teknon? You too, my child? Some historians believe it was a dying man's heartbreak. Others argue it was a curse, a common Greek phrase meaning, your turn will come. We cannot know. But we know what Caesar did next. He stopped fighting. He pulled his toga over his face, a Roman gesture of dignity in death, and fell at the base of Pompey's statue. Of the 23 wounds catalogued by Caesar's physician, a man named Antistius, who performed what may be the first forensic autopsy in recorded history, only one was fatal. A single thrust between the ribs, penetrating the thorax. The blade that collapsed his lung and ended the life of the most powerful man in the world. Antistius never recorded whose hand delivered it. The assassins expected celebration. Brutus walked out of the theater of Pompey with his hands dripping blood and addressed the Roman people. He called them liberators. He declared the Republic saved.
Rome stared back in silence. 3 days later, Mark Antony stood before the Roman mob at Caesar's public funeral. He did not need to call the assassins traitors. He simply read Caesar's will aloud. Caesar had left his private gardens to the people of Rome as a public park. He had left every Roman citizen 300 sesterces, roughly 3 months' wages for a laborer. And he had named his grandnephew, 18-year-old Gaius Octavius, as his adopted son and primary heir. Then Antony held up Caesar's bloodied toga, slashed with 23 holes, and the city erupted. The mob burned the Senate House. They hunted the conspirators through the streets. A poet named Cinna, who had nothing to do with the conspiracy but shared a name with one of the plotters, was torn apart by the crowd. But the real reckoning was slower and far more devastating. What followed Caesar's death was not the restoration of the Republic. It was 13 years of civil war that killed the Republic permanently. Caesar's adopted son, the teenager Octavian, formed an alliance with Antony and Lepidus. Together, they compiled proscription lists, names of enemies to be executed without trial. According to Appian, 300 senators and 2,000 equestrians were condemned. Cicero, the greatest orator in Roman history who had cheered Caesar's death, was hunted down. His head and hands were cut off and nailed to the rostra in the Forum, the very platform where he had delivered his most famous speeches. Brutus and Cassius raised armies in the east. At the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, both were defeated. Cassius ordered his own freedmen to run him through with a sword. Brutus threw himself on his blade, dying, according to Plutarch, with a quote from a Greek tragedy on his lips. Every single one of the leading conspirators died within 3 years of the assassination. Not one of them lived to see the world they thought they were building. And the Republic they claimed to be saving? Octavian became Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. The political system the assassins stabbed Caesar to protect was replaced by precisely the thing they feared: one-man rule. But not for a generation, for 5 centuries. "23 wounds, 60 conspirators, one fatal blow whose author will never be known." Caesar's greatest strength was his mercy. He believed that if he forgave his enemies, they would become his allies. He was wrong, not because mercy is weak, but because he misunderstood what his mercy felt like from the other side. To the men who received it, every pardon was a chain. And on March 15th, they did not stab Caesar to free Rome. They stabbed him to free themselves from the debt of being spared. But here is the part that haunts. The blades that killed Caesar also killed the thing his killers loved most. Every historian who has studied this period reaches the same conclusion. The Republic was dying before Caesar crossed the Rubicon. The system was broken. Rigged elections, political violence, private armies, a Senate that served itself instead of the people. Caesar did not destroy the Republic. He was a symptom of its collapse. And by killing him, the conspirators did not cure the disease. They accelerated it. Dante placed Brutus and Cassius in the lowest circle of hell, frozen in Satan's jaws alongside Judas Iscariot, the 3 greatest traitors in history. John Wilkes Booth shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, after shooting Abraham Lincoln, explicitly casting himself as a new Brutus.
2,000 years later, we are still arguing. Was Brutus a patriot or a traitor? Was Caesar a tyrant or a reformer? Was the assassination justice or the greatest act of self-destruction in political history? The men in that semicircle believed they were saving a republic. What they built instead was an empire. And the question this file leaves open, the question that has no clean answer, is whether the republic was ever theirs to save. If this file disturbed you, wait until you hear about Princess Olga of Kiev, a woman who burned an entire city alive with birds to avenge